Well, the rise in tensions comes hard on the heels of America's withdrawal from the Iran nuclear agreement, which European leaders are now scrambling to salvage. Germany, France and Britain have promised to stay in their part of the deal, as some of Europe's biggest companies have billions of dollars on the line. European plane maker Airbus has large operations in France. It's got a $25 billion deal to supply Iran with more than 100 aircraft. French oil giant Total has been planning to invest $5 billion in South Pars. It's the world's largest gas field. And car makers Renault and Peugeot have signed multi-million-dollar agreements. German companies with interest include the Mercedes owner Daimler and Volkswagen. Engineering firm Siemens was in talks to develop Iran's rail network. And chemical company BASF had wanted to explore oil fields. The UK has got less on the line, but Royal Dutch Shell and British Petroleum were in talks to develop the oil industry. Telecoms company Vodafone wanted to invest in the mobile network. Natasha Butler has more from Paris.
Well, French government ministers have been working very hard on a plan to try and reduce, minimise or even get rid of the impact of US sanctions on French companies working in Iran. There's a sense of urgency here, certainly a sense of frustration. We heard from the French foreign minister a bit earlier saying Europeans should not be made to pay for the fact that the United States has decided to pull out of the Iran deal. Now, we have a host of French multinationals that have been working with Iran ever since sanctions were lifted in 2016. We're talking about companies like car makers Renault, Peugeot Citroën, drug company Sanofi, and of course energy giant Total that has invested very heavily in gas fields in Iran. French finance minister Bruno Le Maire has been very busy trying to rally people around. He says Europe needs to step up and do more, and he says France is going to try and present some measures to block these sanctions, the impact of them on French companies, to the European Commission in the next few days.
La réplique, c'est celle qu'a définie le président de la République hier.
It's high time for Europe to move from words to actions in terms of economic sovereignty. It's high time it develops the same instruments that the US has to defend its economic interests.
Well, early on Friday, we heard from one Iranian minister who said that the European plane maker Airbus is going to give a decision in the coming days on whether or not it will continue with its deal with Iran Air. Now, basically, Airbus signed a deal with Iran Air back in 2016 to deliver 100 planes. It was a deal worth billions of dollars, but in this climate of uncertainty, nobody knows what is going to happen next.
Besma Momani is a professor at Waterloo University in Canada, where she specialises in foreign policy related to the Middle East. She says it's going to be a tough road ahead for European interests in Iran.
Companies may eventually get waivers. They may, in fact, be insulated and protected by, let's say, the EU and some sort of legal measure to allow them to continue to operate. But how are they going to get their money out of Iran? And this is the biggest challenge for many companies left. Will they be able to get their money out through credit swaps, through, let's say, their central banks? That's an option. But the international financial system is so American-dominated that it's really difficult to get their money out using American banks and their affiliates and even international ones, because they have so many global operations in the United States and beyond. They're just not willing to incur the potential sanctions that come with it. I mean, many people are referring to Cuba, right? I mean, Europe and Canada, for example, they had continued to trade with Cuba despite sort of the sanctions that the Americans tried to have, particularly secondary or tertiary sanctions. I think that's a great example. You know, there's going to be, I think, a lot of creative attempts to find ways to continue operating in Iran. And don't forget here, I think at the end of the day, the fact that the Americans pulled out will allow the European countries to say, look, this is not a breach of an agreement that the Iranians did. This is basically the Americans pulling out. Why should our companies have to suffer? But at the end of the day, frankly, it's all going to be up to lawyers and the legal system to basically arbitrate this. If the Europeans pull out or are scared off from continuing their investments in Iran, they're going to be the greatest beneficiaries. companies. Both China and Russia have said that they're going to continue to do business. On the Russian side, obviously, they're under American sanctions already, so they don't care of any secondary sanctions that are going to come on them. And the Chinese are not really well integrated in the international banking system, so they don't care. So they're going to benefit enormously. And I think that's going to have to be pitched or explained to Donald Trump in many ways that, if the sanctions are, reimposed and become heavy-handed on the European companies, these are two competitors that are really going to benefit, and that's not in the long-term American interest either.